All right. So today's topic is language, truth, and propositions. So we're going to start off with just a little bit of English 101 and talk about different ways we use language, more specifically, three different kinds of sentences. So we have interrogative sentences, which are questions, imperative sentences, which are commands, and declarative sentences, which are statements. So, if I say, will it rain tomorrow? That's an interrogative question. If I say, bring an umbrella, that's an imperative sentence. And if I say, it is raining, that is a declarative sentence. So, unlike questions and commands, declarative sentences make a claim about the world. And of these three types, only declarative sentences can be true or false. So a question cannot be true or false, and a command cannot be true or false, but it is raining can be either true or false. So we're talking about arguments in critical thinking. Arguments are going to use declarative sentences for both premises and conclusions. So this video is about the nature of truth. That's one of the primary things we're going to be thinking about today. And I think to sort of get us started on this question, like what is truth? How does truth work? I think it's good to start with the question, well, what does it mean for a declarative sentence to be true? And many philosophers have proposed that truth has to do with correspondence. Truth is closely related to correspondence to the world. So here's kind of a basic correspondence principle that we can start off with. A sentence is true means that things really are that way, or that sentence corresponds to the world. So, for example, snow is white is true just in case snow is white in the actual world. In other words, the sentence, snow is white, is true just in case snow is in fact white. Okay, so that almost sounds trivial. It's like, that's just such an obvious point. Why are we even talking about this? Of course, snow is white is true if snow is white. So here's why I think this is important and actually even potentially controversial. People like to say the phrase true for me. Um, because of this phrase, I actually think the correspondence principle is at odds with what's a popular, but I think totally wrong way of thinking about truth. So here's an example that will illustrate this. The earth is flat. Consider that statement, right? Back in the day, many people believed this, and they even potentially had good evidence for it. Like all the people around them believed it, the experts believed it. When they looked at the horizon, the earth seemed flat. And so you might say, well, the earth is flat. It's true for them back in that day, but it's not true for us because now we know the earth is round. So we're using this true for me kind of language. Um, the problem is that this is actually at odds with the correspondence principle. And the reason for that is because believing the earth is flat, the statement the earth is flat, that does not correspond to the world. And remember, we said something's true when and only when it corresponds to the world. That's what it means to be true. So if the correspondence principle is right, then these people are just simply wrong. They had a false belief. Maybe they had evidence for that belief. Maybe that belief was even rational, but their belief was false. So the correspondence principle is sort of at odds with this popular way of thinking about truth, which is that something can be true for me, but not for you. I want to talk about some harder cases though, because with the earth is flat case, we kind of clearly know that the earth is not flat, it's round. But consider something that people disagree about today. God exists. It's a hard question. Philosophers have been debating about it for a very long time. The debate is still very live, and there's not some kind of consensus among most people about this question, whether God exists or not. So it's a harder case. But notice that even though this case is harder and there's kind of evidence on both sides and there's a lot of disagreement about it, that doesn't mean that God exists for some people and not for others. God exists or God doesn't exist. We don't have people living in different realities where those that believe God exists in that reality, but those that don't believe God exists, God doesn't exist in that reality. No, 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 no. It's either the case that God exists or the case that God doesn't exist. So among this disagreement, one group is right and one group is wrong. Here's some other examples. Eating factory farm meat is morally wrong. On his 25th birthday, Aristotle woke up with an even number of hairs on his head. Goldbach's conjecture, which is an unproven mathematical theorem, is true. So all of these sentences are either true or false, and whether they're true or false is all about whether they correspond to the world. And what this shows is a sentence can be really difficult to know. Like, how would we ever know if Aristotle woke up with an even number of hairs on his head on his 25th birthday? It's really hard to get that information. We disagree about the truth. People disagree about whether it's wrong to eat factory farm meat. But just because it's difficult to know the truth and we disagree about it doesn't mean the correspondence theory is false. And in fact, what the lesson is that we don't always have perfect access to the truth. But the fact that we don't have this perfect access doesn't mean that truth isn't correspondence to the world. It just means that we don't know everything, and evidence can be difficult to assess. And in these harder cases, we don't always know, is that statement true or is that statement false? But that doesn't mean that it's not actually true or false. It's just beyond our knowledge at this point. Okay, so our first sort of main lesson from this lecture is let's avoid phrases like true for me and true for you. I think a lot of times when people use phrases like that, what they're saying is, I believe this and you don't believe this. They're saying maybe we disagree on this, but truth isn't relative to a person. Truth is about correspondence to the world. It's not about whether I believe something or not. So I'm going to suggest that we don't use the phrase true for me. We don't use the phrase true for you, because truth is about correspondence, not about what someone does or doesn't believe. Okay, so we have this sort of correspondence principle that we started off with, and then I talked a little bit about why that might be controversial, and basically the reason is it means that things aren't true for me or true for you. They're true if they correspond to the world. But what I want to do now is refine the basic correspondence principle that was talking about sentences and explain what a proposition is, and then state a new correspondence principle in terms of a proposition rather than a sentence. I wanted to introduce it in terms of sentences initially because I think it makes it a little bit easier to understand, but now I want to show how we can make it a little bit more accurate. Okay, so far what we've been focusing on is the truth value of a sentence. This is a bit of a simplification. So here's an argument that two people might have. Bob says, I did the dishes. And then John says, no, I did the dishes. So a sentence is a string of words. And in this case, Bob and John both utter the same sentence. They say the same string of words, I did the dishes, right? But clearly, Bob and John disagree. Bob thinks Bob did the dishes and John thinks John did the dishes, right? So even though they're uttering the same sentence, one is saying something true and one is saying something false, depending on who actually did the dishes. So both of the sentences, the strings of words that they utter, they can't be true. The things that they say can't be true at the same time, even though it's the same sentence. So because of this confusion, the fact that you can utter a sentence in one context and it's true, and you can utter the exact same sentence, the exact same string of words in another context and it's false, because of this, philosophers think that when it really comes to the deep nature of truth, it's not just about a sentence. It's not just about a string of words. Instead, it's about a proposition. So the same string of words can be true or false depending on the context. So we make a distinction between a sentence, which is a string of words, and a proposition. So a proposition is the thought or the idea that's expressed by a sentence. So in our debate between Bob and John, even though they say the same sentence, they're expressing different thoughts or ideas. Bob is saying, I did the dishes, Bob did the dishes. And then John is saying, no, John did the dishes. So it's the same sentence, but it's a different idea behind what they're saying. And what's interesting is you can have two different sentences that express the same idea. Here's some examples. Doug hugged Mary, or Mary was hugged by Doug. Those are different strings of words, but they express the same idea, the same proposition. And maybe even a more clear example is you can actually express the same proposition in two different languages. So snow is white, and then Google Translate very helpfully translated that into Spanish for us. So the sentence snow is white expressed in Spanish is a different string of words than the sentence snow is white. But they express the same idea or thought, which is that snow is white. And the same sentence can express two different propositions. So this is our Bob and John example. They both say the same sentence, I did the dishes, but they're expressing a different thought or idea by that sentence. So this brings us to our next main idea, which is that sentences, strings of words, express propositions, which are ideas. But again, the same sentence can express different ideas, and in some cases, two sentences can express the same idea. Okay, so now we have this distinction in hand between sentences and propositions. And I think we can use that to kind of refine this correspondence principle. And again, the correspondence principle is telling us the nature of truth. What does it mean for something to be true? What is truth? So instead of thinking about truth in terms of sentences, let's think about truth in terms of the idea or thought that's expressed by a sentence. And so what philosophers will often say is, well, what's true or false isn't ultimately, it's not a sentence, it's this thing, a proposition that we've been talking about. And a proposition is true when and only when it expresses or describes things as they actually are. So a true proposition corresponds to the world. When Bob says, I did the dishes, that's true. That proposition is that Bob did the dishes. And that proposition is true when it's true that Bob was the one who did the dishes, when that proposition corresponds to the world. And a proposition is false when it doesn't describe things as they actually are. So a false proposition does not correspond to the world. So when John says, I did the dishes, if Bob's the one who actually did them, even though John utters the same sentence that Bob does, the proposition behind, expressed by John's sentence, I did the dishes, is false because Bob did them. So that would be a false proposition. So to be more accurate and to really get at the deep nature of truth, we need to think about truth in terms of propositions, which are thoughts or ideas, rather than terms of just a string of words. Okay, so at this point, we've talked about an initial correspondence principle and then revised that correspondence principle in terms of the distinction between a sentence and a proposition. But I wanted to kind of give a clarification here about what this correspondence principle means for truth and how it depends on us. So on the correspondence theory, truth is objective in the sense that it's about corresponding to the world, not about our beliefs or about our culture's beliefs. When something's true, it's because of the way that the world is. But there are some truths that depend on us. For example, I love ice cream. I love ice cream is true, depends on my preferences. And if ice cream is something I enjoy and I prefer and I want to eat and I think is tasty, then it's true that I love ice cream. And if those things, if my preferences aren't for ice cream, or I don't like ice cream, or I think it's too cold, I mean, who doesn't like ice cream? But, then it's going to be false that I love ice cream. So that truth, whether that proposition expressed by I love ice cream is true, is going to depend on me. Another example, everyone in my family opposes the death penalty. That truth is going to depend on the opinions of my family. Or she is popular. The truth of that is going to depend on people's beliefs or opinions about whoever she is, right? So whether these things are true does depend on people's tastes and thoughts and feelings. But this is actually totally consistent with the correspondence theory. And this is because we as human persons are a part of the world. And since we're a part of the world, remember, truth is correspondence to the world. So certain propositions are going to depend on us. and it's those that are about us, right? But note that many, if not most truths, they don't depend on us in this way. So, for example, the earth is round. That's not a proposition about what someone believes or prefers or desires. That's a proposition about the earth and its shape. So, that is not going to depend on us for its truth value. It is wrong to break a promise. That's about morality. It's not about my preferences or my beliefs. It's not about me. It's about what's right and what's wrong. Again, that's not going to depend on me for its truth value. God does not exist. We've talked about this example already. It's not that God exists for me and not for you. It depends on whether there is a God or not. So many propositions, including ones we disagree on quite a bit, they're not going to depend on our beliefs or desires or preferences. They're going to depend on the way that the world is. So again, there are propositions like I love ice cream that do depend on us, but just because lots of people disagree on something doesn't mean the truth of that proposition depends on us. Okay, so we've talked about truth, we've talked about two versions of the correspondence principle and then some clarifications about those. And you might say, like, what does this have to do with critical thinking? Why are we talking about this? Well, critical thinking is about evaluating arguments. And when we evaluate arguments, it's not enough to merely read a sentence that an author utters. What we have to do is we have to figure out what is the thought or the idea that the author is expressing. So part of what we're doing in critical thinking is figuring out what propositions an author expresses. And it can get tricky here because language is messy. Again, we can express the same idea with different sentences. We can express different ideas with the same sentence. Some sentences maybe don't even express a proposition at all. So it's just hard to see what proposition a sentence expresses. To give a really basic example, you might say, we live next to a bank. Okay, is that a financial institution? Is that a river? The sentence is ambiguous. And if you don't have the right clarification or context, it's difficult to determine whether it's true or false because it's difficult to determine what is the proposition being uttered, what is the thought or idea behind this sentence. So part of determining whether a sentence is true or false is figuring out what proposition is expressed. And like I just mentioned, some sentences are just nonsense. It's just a string of words that doesn't say anything, so it wouldn't express a coherent thought or idea. So we're going to look at language, we're going to look at sentences, and then try to figure out what are the propositions being expressed. And then once we do that, then we can ask, is this true or is this false? And what's really nice is once we know what the proposition being expressed is, we don't have to deal with the messiness of language. We do express propositions using language, but propositions are ideas. They're not just a string of words. So this brings us to kind of our final important lesson, which is that every proposition, so every thought or idea, has exactly one truth value. It's either true or it's false, but it's not both and it's not neither. We may not know that truth value. We don't know how many hairs were on Socrates' head when he woke up on his 25th birthday. And we might disagree about that truth value. We disagree about whether God exists. But those propositions are either true or false, not both, and not neither. So when we evaluate an argument, we talked about we're going to identify the premises of that argument, the reasons that support that conclusion. And we're going to do that by saying, well, what are the sentences that are used to support the author's conclusion? And then what propositions do those sentences express? And I think this is one reason that standard form is very useful in evaluating arguments because it makes the propositions that support the conclusion easier to identify. They're expressed on their own line. They're often numbered, although this picture they're not numbered, but each proposition is clearly different from the other. And then on that line, hopefully they're written as clearly as possible. So it makes it easy to see what proposition is being expressed so we can determine that truth value. And then using this, we can answer to the best of our ability, are these propositions true or false? And remember, they're either true or false, not both, and not neither, like we just talked about. So, truth is an extremely important component of argument evaluation, and that's why it's worth spending a whole video on the nature of truth. Okay, so what we have covered today, we've talked about three kinds of sentences: declarative, interroga, ugh, the question one, and declarative. We're focusing on declarative sentences. We've given a basic correspondence principle in terms of sentences, strings of words. And we've said why we don't use the phrase true for me. Um, talked about the distinction between sentences, which is a string of words, and a proposition, which is the idea expressed by that string of words. And then we've given a refined correspondence principle for propositions and a clarification about it, which is that some truths do depend on us, but just because we disagree about a truth, it doesn't mean it depends on us. The propositions that do depend on us are ones that are about our beliefs or our desires or our preferences, that kind of thing. And then we've talked about why the nature of truth is so important for critical thinking and argument evaluation, figuring out what premises there are, what are the propositions expressed in those premises, and then ultimately evaluating whether they're true or false. So here's the three main points I want you to remember. One, avoid saying true for me. Truth is about correspondence to the world, not about your beliefs. Two, sentences, which are strings of words, express propositions, which are thoughts or ideas. Propositions are ultimately the thing we're going to evaluate for being true or being false. And then every proposition has exactly one truth value. It is either true or false. And much of the content from this is taken from Feldman's Reason and Argument, Chapter 2.